two papers in sequence and then have discussions, breaking it into questions to panelists and then more commentaries and engaging the arguments in the second part. The first speaker in the panel is Professor Dina Khoury from George Washington University, Washington, D.C., the U.S. Dina Khoury is Associate Professor of History and International Affairs. Professor Khoury has researched the history of the Iraqi borderland in the Ottoman Empire, focusing on, in particular, on social history and history of religious identities and missionary activities. She did engage a comparative history, writing in a comparison between the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire, with originally specific focus as the ground for engaging in comparative history. She has recently finished a book from the most recent project that focused on the Iraqi Memory Foundation archives and those archival collections that were taken from Iraq after the Second Iraqi War. And the book is coming out very soon.
Very soon, I don't know. It depends how Cambridge handles it, but certainly I hope.
Let's hope.
In
Let's
the next few months, yes.
Very interesting study between memory, politics, and the archive and history of the archive. But for our workshop, she comes back to the Ottoman history and the paper entitled "The Ottoman Effect and the Frontiers of Empire: Imaginings of Tribe and Sect in the 19th Century."
I want to begin by saying that what I'm going to be talking about is actually not the paper I wrote for this conference, in large part because I rewrote this paper to generate debate and move it away. So the abstract is not particularly well related to what I'm going to be talking about. I'd like you also to begin by thanking Imperio and Sasha for inviting me as the token historian of the Ottoman Empire. And in the interest of tokenism, I'm going to sketch a very, very simplistic, I would say, and simplified version of what constitutes Ottoman exceptionalism and talk about it in the context of the borderlands between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire in the 19th century. I'm not sure if my use of the term of exceptionalism in the Ottoman context is commensurable, a word that Sasha likes using a lot, with the way it is used in this meeting. Within the 19th century Ottoman context, the word exceptionalism does not come up either in the literature written by policy elite or by intellectuals. Rather, what emerges are a set of distinctions that are based on perceptions of a civilizing elite and an uncivilized periphery or group. Despite my trepidation, and also for the sake of discussion, however, I will use the term exceptionalism. What I'd like to do is to address briefly one narrative of exceptionalism that is born out of the most recent historiography of the late Ottoman Empire. Most of this new historiography insists that the older narratives of the late Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe are part of the orientalizing project, and as well as an ideological project of European empires. That reading of the Ottomans saw them as a weak, backward state, engaged in reforms that were pressed on them by European powers. They lost territory and lost economic and as well as political sovereignty. And their reforms were, their economic and political modernization project remained superficial and did not penetrate deep into Ottoman society. This was a discourse of Ottoman exceptionalism that both Ottoman intellectuals and political elites tried to address throughout the late Ottoman period, and it is a kind of exceptionalism that the current research of the empire tries to address. Recent historiography insists that the Ottoman imperial state in the 19th and early 20th century was successful in establishing modern, often hybrid forms of citizenship, modern administrative structures, and it created new and more expansive provincial elite and established new forms of imperial rule. In other words, rather than the sick and failing empire with a facade of modernity, the Ottoman state was a working imperial power, coping with a great deal of internal and external pressures, successful in projecting its power inwardly and externally in ways comparable to other imperial formations in the late 19th century. It is in this context that Ottoman official and Ottoman elites, particularly urban-based elites, at the center as well as the periphery of empire, began articulating a version of Ottoman exceptionalism. That exceptionalism worked both inwards within the empire and outwards in the projection of the image of the empire in Europe. In its representation and projection of power outwards, in European forums such as world fairs and visits by Ottoman ambassadors overseas, the Ottomans represented themselves as an Oriental empire, thus building and reinforcing for their own uses the image of their exceptionalism. Exceptionalism was a strategy of rule that sought to address a universal language of late European imperialism. This, I think, is the apparent contradiction of a modernizing empire seeking to speak the language of late imperialism. However, in their attempts to create new forms of imperial rule within the empire, the Ottomans followed what appears to be a more varied and hybrid approach. In their dealing with frontier areas, they themselves created a narrative of exceptionalism about certain sectors of their populations, such as tribes and certain religious sects that were now transformed into modern terms of minorities and majorities. These were now orientalized because their social practices were considered outside the fold of modern cultural and citizenship practices. In frontier areas, notably in places like newly conquered Yemen in southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, the Ottomans developed a hybrid form of imperial rule distinct from older forms, which relied on a negotiated, the older forms that is, on a negotiated settlement between the state, local intermediaries, and a laissez-faire attitude towards religious difference. The Ottoman conquest of Yemen, for example, was a response to European imperial encroachments, particularly British ones, on what had been an area under Ottoman sphere of influence, if not outright control. Yemen provides, as Thomas Kuhn has demonstrated, the foil to study the introduction of forms of imperial rule that seem to incorporate ideas of Ottoman citizenship with a form of colonial distinction and rule that mirrors consciously at times the models of British colonialism. The result is what he calls Ottoman colonialism, a form of rule that is thoroughly modern and distinct from traditional forms of Ottoman imperial rule. It was colonial, according to Kuhn, precisely because it introduced new categories of colonial distinction based on uncivilized nature of conquered peoples and the drawing of sectarian boundaries. What I'd like to do today is complicate this narrative of internal Ottoman exceptionalism. I'd like to argue that the use of exceptionalism, or in the case of the Ottomans, the orientalization of certain categories of people for the purposes of managing difference, was always a strategic and contingent undertaking. In marked contrast to other imperial undertakings in the same period, no organizations or institutions developed until quite late in the empire for the study of subject populations as the other. Rather than being an ideology of rule developed consistently and systematically throughout Ottoman space, the use of exceptionalism was a strategy deployed in specific circumstances to deal with specific problems of regulating difference. It operated differently depending on imperial imperatives, the availability of local interlocutors, and the limits of state resources. So exceptionalism was a contingent discourse, as it was a contingent policy, and it was always situational. In other words, I'm not sure we can claim that it was ever a normative or a homogenizing discourse. It was only in the late 1980s and 1890s that the lines began to harden in response to international pressures as well as internal ones. Even then, however, the deployment of an Ottoman civilizational discourse was used, at least in the Arab provinces of the empire, which is my area of expertise, in conjunction with others, such as a cosmopolitan liberal citizenship and an Islamic imperial citizenship. I want to talk about the exceptionalism, exceptionalism as a strategic and contingent discourse of rule on the borderland of empire, and particularly in the Iraqi provinces, by focusing on tribe and sect, two categories of difference that become central to the articulation of Ottoman power in the 19th century. And I want to talk about them in three specific historical settings. The first is the setting of an Ottoman commission to draw the border between the Ottoman eastern frontier with Qajar, Persia. The second in the context of an 1869 citizenship law, which granted citizenship to all Ottoman subjects. And the third in the context of Sultan Abdul Hamid's policy beginning in the 1880s to convert Shi'i and other more heterodox sects among the tribal and rural populations of Iraq. Khoury Pasha was an official appointed by the Ottoman government to report on the populations of the Ottoman Persian frontiers for a border commission organized at the insistence of the British and the Russians to determine the borders between Qajar, Persia and the Ottoman Empire in the wake of border skirmishes between the Ottomans and Persians. Khoury Pasha undertook what he termed a journey to the borderlands. The text and report that he offers is a new kind of knowledge of tribal populations in two ways. Whereas previous official documents surveying the rural frontier world of Iraq had been produced as fiscal documents, taxable populations of the empire listing numbers of households and natural resources, this official report provided an ethnographic survey of tribes, their divisions, their way of life. In this respect, what emerges from this survey is less a report with a fiscal agenda than a description of a tribal world in which a middle ground, to use Richard White's phrase to describe the relationship of Algonquin Indians and European settlers in the Great Lake regions of North America, in which this middle ground had developed, forms of accommodation based on negotiations that were marked by alternating periods of cooperation and hostility prevailed. Tribes provided a military labor force for provincial Ottoman rulers based in administrative centers. Their elites created market towns or settled towns for periods of time and were essential in controlling the trade networks between the Indian Ocean, Persia, the Persian empires, and Arabia. The tribal world that Khoury Pasha described is one in which ethnicity, religious orthodoxy, Islamic and state law seem to have little impact in organizing the lives of their inhabitants. It is this world that the Ottoman state needed to insert itself in to curtail the movement of tribes across borderlands. The fact that the Border Commission concluded its work only in 1914 is an indication of the limited success of the state in making this confusing and highly fluid frontier into a legible border. But Khoury Pasha's report, or really travelogue cum report, is indicative of a new imagining of the tribal world, partly based on conversations with local informants and partly on observation. It bespoke a new positivist description of tribal populations as types rather than taxable subjects. It was now these types that needed to be molded into obedient citizen subjects of the empire. The report went into several printings, and although it's not clear to me, because I haven't done the research on this, how it circulated among Ottoman elites at the center, so I can't speak to its effectiveness in creating a discourse on tribe, a new kind of discourse on tribes. Let me now move to the next period. In 1869, the Ottoman government issued citizenship law, which granted every inhabitant of Ottoman territories the Ottoman citizenship, that is to say, with that, a passport. The law came in the wake of several developments. The first was the attempt to regulate the practice by a number of minorities, both Christian and Muslim, to obtain European and other citizenships to escape the strictures of Ottoman law, including the law of conscription. It also came in the wake of a push among Ottoman intellectuals as well as state political elites to forge a notion of Ottoman citizenship that is non-ethnic and non-minoritarian. It was, as some Ottomans have agreed, the Ottoman Empire's experiment with liberalism. By 1876, it had resulted in the creation of the first Ottoman constitutional government, a short-lived experiment that ended with a coup and the ascension of Abd al-Hamid as Sultan and the dissolution of the Ottoman government and imposition of a new kind of authoritarian rule. Within borderland areas like the Iraqi provinces, the citizenship law soon raised a question, the central question of how to incorporate tribes into new imaginings of Ottoman citizenship. How to make the tribal word described by Khurshid Pasha more legible, subject to administrative regulations and moderate forms of taxation. The Ottoman state introduced new administrative reforms and a new land code that turned princely lineages within tribes into feudatory leaders of their own tribesmen, who were now settled agriculturists. The new tribal feudatories were appointed administrators of their domain in exchange for ensuring that their tribesmen refrained from any raiding activities, curtailed their tendency to hire themselves out as a military labor force, and became productive rural citizens of the empire. To make the sons of tribal leaders come administrators into good Ottoman citizens, a special college was set up in Istanbul to educate them. As good tribal citizens, they were subject to Ottoman civilizational project. But to turn them as part of that civilizational project, the tribe had to be rendered into a category of exception. The tribal world and the social practices of that world had to be rendered uncivilized. Those tribes that refused to settle and work within the new administrative system were described as animal-like, as savage. Only when tribes settled in cities, become part of an administrative or feudatory elite, do they become civilized. But they do not lose their tribal essence when they do so. Thus, while the Ottoman policy attempted to destroy the tribal social system of organization by turning tribesmen into semi-inserved peasants and tribal princely lineages into feudal lords, the cultural policy they followed imagined the Iraqi space as a tribal space in need of a civilizational project. It reinforced the idea of tribe as an exceptional kind of Ottoman citizenship. Let me now move to the third period, which I want to talk about. The Ottoman concern with the demarcation of borders and with the incorporation of tribe into Ottoman notions of citizenship was exacerbated in the 1880s with another problem, that of the conversion of a substantial portions of tribal populations of southern and central Iraq to Shia Islam from a nominal adherence to a Sunni Islam. The process had begun earlier in the 19th century, but it became a problem that needed to be dealt with in a very specific context. The Ottoman government had, by the 1880s, lost the bulk of its European territories and the crucial Ottoman province of Egypt. Under Sultan Abd al-Hamid, a pan-Islamic foreign policy projected towards British and in India and Africa was accompanied with a policy within the empire to counter missionary activities, both among Christians and Muslims. Within the empire itself, a form of religious orthodoxy based on a modernization of religion instruction and the defining of boundaries between orthodoxy and heterodoxy became part of official state policy. A campaign to train preachers and send them to combat Shi'i and other forms of heterodoxy extended from Yemen in southwestern part of Arabian Peninsula to Iraq. Two aspects of the conversion to Shi'ism within Iraq were problematic. The first was that by converting to Shi'ism, residents of the Iraqi provinces could sue for Persian citizenship to avoid being conscripted in the Ottoman army. The second was that the majority of converts were tribesmen in rural areas, where a great deal of missionary activity was funded by religious scholars and endowments whose monies came from both Persia and India. It is within this context that the twinning of sect and tribe took place. The tribes of southern and central Iraq were now subject to a double civilizing mission: to settle them, turn them into Ottoman citizens, and convert them to an orthodox version of Sunni Islam. What I've tried to do thus far is through very broad strokes and woefully simplified narrative in what appears to be a linear trajectory of Ottoman internal exceptionalism, from a negotiable and contingent management of difference to one of harder lines of distinction between those who were included within the Ottoman narrative of empire and those who were included precisely because of their exclusion. But I want to stress that this is a selective reading of Ottoman policy and imaginings of borderlands. Ottoman imaginings, at least when it came to that of tribe and sect, was at all times tempered by the limits of Ottoman power on the ground and the continuous need, at least on the Iraqi borderlands, to negotiate the middle ground that survived despite Ottoman state attempts to regulate it. It's perhaps telling that during World War I, the Young Turk Ottoman government drew on Shi'i tribes as well as Shi'i religious scholars to defend the empire. They appealed to the military labor market of these tribes that they had been unable to regulate in their fight against the British. If the Ottoman civilizing mission had been successful, it was of a limited success. There's, of course, before I conclude any discussion when we talk about Ottoman exceptionalism, there's the problem of the Armenian genocide, which actually took place on the borderlands of Iraq, and part of the Kurdish populations of Kurdish tribes who lived in the northeastern part of the Iraqi provinces were the people who actually carried out massacres, particularly in the 1890s as well as later on. So when we talk about Ottoman exceptionalism, we have to take that into consideration. And I raise this as a point of discussion, not because I'm an expert in this, but I think we need to complicate the narrative I've just given you, and when we talk about Ottoman exceptionalism. I'd like to conclude with a comment and a story, these both bring us to the post-Ottoman period in Iraq. In a kind of mirroring of Ottoman exceptionalism, the founding myth of Iraqi nationalism is a tribal revolt that took place against the British that took place in 1920. Within this founding myth, the tribe becomes the essence of the Iraqi nation. It defines Iraqi nationhood. It took more than 30 years to construct it as a founding myth, and it continues to be reworked in the Iraqi national mythologies in ways that engage Ottoman exceptionalism about tribe and sect that are quite interesting. And the story I want to tell is one that links Ottoman Baghdad with Russia, and I can't resist telling it because I'm in Kazan and I want to link somehow Baghdad with Russia. In 1914, an Ottoman Baghdadi was drafted into the Ottoman army and went in with Enver Pasha's army into the Caucasus. He was taken prisoner of war to Siberia and stayed until 1927, where he found his way back to Baghdad through Japan. It was the year that the British Mandate government drafted the Iraqi citizenship law. According to that law, every inhabitant who was resident in 1918 of what used to be Ottoman Iraq and who did not hold a Persian or any other citizen was declared citizen of Iraq. To his utter frustration, of course, and incomprehension, our soldier remained without citizenship. He had fought as an Ottoman citizen, had been imprisoned as such, but found that he was neither an imperial citizen or a citizen of a nation. And I suppose this is sort of the new middle ground in Iraq in the 20th century. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you, Dina. And then we move from the southern borderlands of the Ottoman Empire to the territories that once constituted the western borderlands of the Ottoman Empire, and the border region between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. And our next speaker is Andrei Cusco, lecturer in the Department of World History of the Creanga State Pedagogical University in Chisinau, and director of the Center for Empire Studies in the Department of History and Philosophy of Moldova State University in Moldova. Andrei Cusco worked on his dissertation dealing with the languages of nationhood and the context of empire for Bessarabian Moldovan identity in the Central European University. Most recently, he has published, together with his collaborator Victor Taki, both prominently published in Imperio, a book, Bessarabia in the Context of the Russian Empire, came out this year, yes. With the Moscow-based publisher, the New Literary Review. Today's paper by Andrei is entitled The Language of the Nation, the Early 20th Century Bessarabia, Defining an Elusive Concept in a Contested Borderland.
Thank you. Well, as a first caveat, I would like to say that I think I should broaden my topic a bit in order to be more in tune with our discussion here. But of course, I will try to preserve my focus on the early 20th century, but also I will try to reflect, together with you perhaps, on the applicability of, first, the concept of exceptionalism to an imperial periphery that was indeed specific. I don't know to what extent it was exceptional in the Russian context, the 19th and early 20th century. And second, from a methodological point of view, my interrogation is linked to the extent to which one can use the approach of conceptual history or Begriffsgeschichte to a region that did not generate actually its own internal discourse on the nation, on the categories of collective identity until very late in the early 20th century. And then, even then, this debate on the nation was a derivative, a secondary debate, because it referred to the claims, the mutual claims of inclusion of Bessarabia either into the Russian Imperial or the Romanian national project. So in a way, we deal with a region that by itself was not very remarkable in the Russian context if we think in terms of economy or territory or population or even its impact on the imperial imaginings. But on the other hand, this region does tell us some interesting, I think, things about how the categories of imperial perception of and policy in the borderlands shifted throughout the 19th century, and thus could also serve as a case of or a first step towards a comparative analysis of empires in this period. So to give you a short context of where Bessarabia was situated with regard to other peripheries of the Russian Empire in the first and then the second half of the 19th century, I probably should start by focusing on the transitional status of this province from a spatial point of view. That is, in the first half of the 19th century, after its integration into the empire in 1812, Bessarabia was oscillating between being categorized as a western borderland of the empire, which meant the existence of a structured local elite with which the center could negotiate. At least that was the perception of the imperial center. This perception was very quickly abandoned. And on the other hand, it was also categorized as a part of the new Russia region, a region of colonization, of population politics, and of difference in the sense of ethnic, religious, cultural diversity. So actually Bessarabia had this transitional status which had an important impact on the terms of its perception by the imperial center, but also on the terms of its population's self-perception. The second context that can be applied to the Bessarabian case is its insertion in the early 19th century in the Russian discourse on the Danubian principalities at Moldavia and Wallachia, that is, on the Balkan region. And in this sense, one could say that until roughly the 1830s, if not a bit later, Bessarabia did not figure as a separate object of imperial policy and imaginings, again, in the Russian context, because it was mostly associated with the larger region of Moldavia and Wallachia. So what we have is a dual, if you want, problem. First of all, the uncertain status of Bessarabia itself within the empire, and this constant oscillation between the Western Borderland and the Borderlands and the New Russia region. On the other hand, we have a gradual disentanglement of Bessarabia, especially in terms of ethnographic observations of dealing with multi-ethnicity, a gradual disentanglement of Bessarabia from the larger Romanian space. And a consequent discovery of the region as a separate borderland of the empire. Now, how does this come about? Well, in the first half of the 19th century, the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, again in association with Bessarabia, were perceived by the Russian intellectuals, the elites, as a part of the symbolic frontier between civilization and barbarity. So we know all this from Larry Wolff. I won't spend too much time on that. But the interesting peculiarity of the Romanian case is that this ethnic community, which was placed strategically in the Balkan, on the way of the Russian troops to Constantinople, this ethnic community was gradually discovered by Russian observers as alien, and this, as foreign to the, and this process developed to the extent that the Romanians acquired a new individuality in the context of the other Balkan peoples as soon as the early 19th century imperial project based on the Enlightenment paradigm was replaced by Panslavism in all its forms and guises. I'm simplifying here. And as soon as Panslavism became a category used in Russian intellectual discourse, the Romanians became a problematic ethnic group because they did not fit into this into the project of Pan-Slavic unity developed at this time. And it is in this context that after the 1830s especially, but gradually until the middle of the 19th century, the Romanians are discovered in their own right as separate people. So from this point of view, we have a sort of an exceptional place of the Romanians in the Russian discourse as the odd people, the odd Balkan people out of the general scheme of Slavic unity. And on the other hand, we have the gradual disentanglement, as I said previously, of the Bessarabian region with its own ethnic structure and the imperial policies applied to it from this larger whole. Trying to understand how national categories began to be applied to the borderlands of the Russian Empire, when exactly ethnicity became a defining category of difference in the Russian Empire, is a methodological challenge, of course. In the case of Bessarabia, this can be dated, well, rather, I would say accurately, because there is a clear evolution from the earlier narrative of national characterology, when the Bessarabian population, again, was still viewed as a part of the Romanian ethnic group, to a more differentiated narrative, which gradually, after the 1840s and 50s, began to integrate Bessarabia as an imperial province, and thus to discover the affinities of its inhabitants with the Russians. So this transition is very important because it really impacted the categories of describing ethnicity, of describing later the national essence of this population, and so on and so forth, both, again, in the center elaborated discourse and the self-perception. And just to give you an example of the first trend, that is national characterology, which did not by any means disappear completely, but which was gradually replaced by the more exclusive, I would say, emphasis on matters Bessarabian. I would invoke the example of a very well-known Russian intellectual, official, and memoirist of the first half of the 19th century, Philip Vigel, who was at one time Bessarabian vice-governor, and thus was involved directly in the shaping of this province and in the empire-building project in Bessarabia. Vigel still did not distinguish between the Bessarabians proper and the Romanians as such, but he gradually, and this is where his interest lies, he gradually evolved from a westernizer to a Slavophile. And if initially his perspective on the Romanians was determined by this Enlightenment model, where the difference was regarded as something desirable, or at least something tolerable, later, especially in his memoirs written in the 1850s, Vigel rediscovers the Romanians and twists their difference to fit the pan-Slavic project that he is infatuated with. How he does that is very interesting, because he tries to depict the history of the Romanians in parallel with Russian history, and concludes that it is not a problem of essential cultural difference, it is a problem of the Romanian history of the present as Russia's past. So that it is a temporal discrepancy, not a cultural difference that is important. That is, where the Romanians are now in the 19th century, the Russians were in the 17th century, before Peter the Great. But the underlying argument that Vigel uses is the critique of modernity, one could say, or at least of the westernizing project pursued by Russia in the Danubian Principalities and the Balkan region. That is, he radically opposes the role that Russia unwittingly, in his view, played in westernizing these people and thus antagonizing them. That is, now the Romanians, the contemporary Romanians of the 1850s, who have been subjected to the pernicious Western influence because of Russia, have turned against their benefactor, as it were. So this argument is not so untypical. On the contrary, it's quite typical in a way. But it does point to some of the major discursive trends that would characterize the later meditations of the Russian observers on the Bessarabian topic. In a way, I don't know if I have time, probably not, to meditate on the other, to reflect on the other part of this Russian-Romanian competition on Bessarabia. That is
10 minutes.
Well, I'll try to sketch at least the broadest outlines, because just as Russia played a very important role in this process of westernization of this region, it also played a very important role in the gradual establishment of the Romanian nationalist discourse, which is the other part of this dichotomy that framed the Bessarabian case. And the depiction of the Russian Empire as the quintessential other of Romanian nation building, which was clearly established after 1848, and especially after the Crimean War, led to this gradual dialogue of the absent, I would say, because when dealing with Bessarabia, both parts referred to each other's discourses without actually mentioning each other. And this is, very difficult to disentangle, but only after the emergence of the Romanian nation-state in the 1860s does this symbolic competition for Bessarabia become direct. Of course, the model of the basic model of Romanian nation building, which was the French model, referred to exactly the Enlightenment, reworked, of course, Enlightenment paradigm that the Russians, at least in their pan-Slavist guise, rejected in the second half of the 19th century. So it is a very peculiar dynamics in this sense. So after the 1860s, when this symbolic Russian-Romanian competition for Bessarabia becomes really the defining feature, I would say, of Bessarabian history, what happens is that in Bessarabia, as I said at the beginning, we only have a very late development of the public sphere and a very late development of what one could call internally generated national discourses. This only happens during the Russian Revolution of 1905-1907. Before that, however, we have a very interesting phenomenon that I would have only the time to refer to shortly, which I would call, a cultural transfer in the Romanian national context of tropes and, motives drawn from the Russian ideological milieu. And this cultural transfer, or if you wish, the activity of a cultural intermediary, was characteristic for Bessarabian-born intellectuals that were educated in the Russian Empire and thus internalized all this, or at least were familiar with the imperial discourses, and the transfer of their activity to the Romanian kingdom. So Bessarabia was put on the map of the Romanian national priorities by people who previously were part of the Russian cultural milieu and who consciously used their knowledge in order to subvert the Russian claims to Bessarabia from the Romanian vantage point. And a very important individual case in this sense is that of Constantin Stere, who is, of course, unknown to all of you, which is natural, but who really is the epitome of this unwilling cultural intermediary, because Stere was a very important figure in transferring Russian political doctrines to the Romanian milieu, to the Romanian environment. For example, he introduced the doctrine of Russian populism and adapted it to Romanian realities. And also he was a figure who, maybe the most important figure, who put Bessarabia on the map, on the symbolic map of the Romanian nation-building project. And he also was one of the most important political doctrinaires, Romanian political doctrinaires, of the late 19th and early 20th century. And in this process, he fruitfully adapted, I would say, his previous Russian experience to the Romanian setting. So again, I would call him an unwilling cultural intermediary in this sense, that he tried to depict or to elaborate a new version of Romanian nation building, starting from his earlier Russian experience and subverting it or using it against the Russian Empire. And here is where I finally come to the early 20th century Bessarabia, to this setting of increasing political mobilization, to a setting where the externally produced discourses, either in Petersburg or in Bucharest, had this interconnection, these interconnections through these cultural intermediaries like Stere, but these interconnections did not reflect directly on the Bessarabian vocabulary of the nation until the Russian Revolution, when, due to this, of course, the opening up of the political sphere, suddenly a Romanian language press appears in Bessarabia. So here I come back to this methodological question of what sources we can use in order to write a conceptual history of this borderland region. And the most obvious answer is the press, of course, because aside from the press, we do not have a solid corpus of sources that could reflect on the categories of, I don't know, empire and nation-building projects in Bessarabia, again, from the internal point of view. If one talks about the press, the Romanian language press especially, and here I only make a short note, the public sphere in Bessarabia really developed quite late, even in its Russian language guise. For example, the first Russian language newspaper printed in Bessarabia only appeared in 1889. So one could say that here Bessarabia was really exceptional in the sense that it was a very late comer, a region which only very late was affected by this, by the debates carried out through print. And the only Romanian language, the first Romanian language newspapers only appeared in 1905, 1907. So if one looks at these Romanian language publications, that one should not forget, of course, appeared in a very politicized already and quite I'd say competitive environment in the Russian Empire. One could see how these Romanian intellectuals framed their view of the nation. And of course, the most striking, if one talks about because of course there were several layers of this press, but the most conspicuous one, I would say, was the nationalist group, so to say, of these intellectuals, who started to define the nation. Not surprisingly, both in political, cultural, but also linguistic terms. So what they used was first the historical argument of referring to the early 19th century experiment with Bessarabian autonomy, when Bessarabia was perceived on a par with Poland and Finland as a possible target of Russian constitutional experiments, which was very quickly abandoned because of the, unfitting character of the local elite. So they reworked this quintessentially imperial experiment of Bessarabian autonomy into a national vision of autonomy. And their arguments referred to this Bessarabian autonomy as based ostensibly on national principles, which of course was never the case in actuality. So this points to the reworking of the imperial vocabulary to fit the new nationalist agendas. Then, of course, they referred to the language issue, to the linguistic issue, because that was the most palpable, I would say, sphere of political emancipation that they could think of. And related to that, of course, there were some motives of cultural emancipation and of economic, that was, of course, to be expected, and of economic redistribution of land to the peasants. But what is striking is how they reappropriated the imperial discourses to fit their national aims, in a way. And gradually, after the 1905-07 revolution, in Bessarabia, what we have is a developing competition between at least three visions of the national organism, I would say, or the national essence, that referred, of course, to both the Russian and most likely to the Romanian contexts that they were derivative from. And again, I would emphasize that even these internally generated discourses were only secondary instances of the exogenous, externally generated identity discourses, either Russian or Romanian ones. So what are these three versions? We have, of course, the one I already mentioned, the nationalist pan-Romanian version of Bessarabian identity, which views Bessarabians as part of the greater Romanian nation. Then we have a regionalist vision of Bessarabian identity, which acknowledges the Bessarabians, well, the Romanian speakers' adherence to belonging to the Romanian nation, but focuses on local matters. And finally, we have the first intimations of what would later develop as a Moldovanist, that is, specific anti-Romanian nationalist agenda that postulates the separateness of the majority inhabitants of Bessarabia from the Romanians. But the third one is, of course, only in its incipient phase. So I would say that this, just to conclude, that these developments only became actualized during World War I, when we have an explosive development of local nationalism, and which results finally in the generation of all these local voices that were absent beforehand. And this happens, of course, after 1916, especially during 1917. So, again, just to revert to my earlier, to my initial remarks, I would, and maybe we could develop this during the discussion, I would question the viability of applying a classical, or whatever, if there is a traditional history of concepts of a Begriffsgeschichte approach to such a very untypical region, or maybe typical, but from the Borderland point of view, which did not generate its own national discourse. And second, in Bessarabia, what we have is actually a transition. I would like to develop that maybe in the discussion if there would be interest. A transition from, a vision of the region centered on the physical presence of imperial dignitaries in this area during the first half of the 19th century. And this perception was epitomized through travelogues, mostly, to an abstract, centralized, and statistically oriented perception that gradually started to view not only Bessarabia but many other borderlands in terms of ethnicity, in terms of clearly classifiable and discernible categories of national or social groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the floor is open. I suggest we start with questions probably, and then since the papers were also rich in their empirical parts and situated historically, and the cases were different. Suggested that. Yes, Turin, please.
I found both papers are absolutely fascinating, perhaps first say. And my question is fairly abstract because I feel that they, in a way, they relate quite strongly. They both seem to be about processes that are derivative, secondary processes, even identities that are derivative and secondary. And they both also seem to be about processes that, in a sense, go wrong. I mean, the first paper was about how ultimately you get the tribal revolt out of all of this, which becomes, the way the empire implodes on that particular frontier. And I think at the end of your paper, it was also about really how ultimately all of these discourses can become something that undermines the imperial strategies that are involved here. So what I was really wondering about, and that's a question to both of you, if you have if this is more or less an accurate reading of your papers, although of course an extremely superficial one, but what is it that distinguishes derivative processes like this from instances where they're not derivative, where they're genuine? Is it just the fact that these instances then are driven by elites that are somehow our own, whereas in these cases where the Ottomans look at the British in Bessarabia or becoming Bessarabia or becoming Romania, elites look at the Russians, in fact, although they will later forget about this. Is that the key to actually then distinguish between derivative, secondary, and non-derivative, non-secondary? And of course, this is a key question of, Eastern European, Central European history. There's this famous, very unpleasant, and I think not very useful caricature of Eastern Europe as sort of the second-hand Europe, where everything also happens, but also.
I would only just add a word to this question that derivative is very interestingly is both a temporal process and a normative discourse.
Yeah.
And that will be interesting if you can address both. Yes, Sergei. Yeah. So I don't see everyone in the room.
Thank you for fascinating papers. And when I was listening to your presentation, actually both of us, myself and Marina, were struck by how many things could just be applied to the case of the Russian Empire directly. You talk about conversion in the 1880s, the attempts at conversion immediately, the intensification of missionary activities, ideas about Russification come to mind. But my question is more about exceptionalism and the use of that category in the Ottoman Empire. And here is why. Of course, we know many of the attempts to provide exceptional regimes, exceptional treatments to various categories of imperial populations. In the case of the Russian Empire, we also see how these processes are often paralleled by varied attempts to imagine extra-European modernity, or some version of a non-European or sort of a little bit different kind of modernity. And sometimes they're blown out of proportion. Sometimes there is just a little, aroma of it. Is there anything like that happening in the Ottoman Empire? To what extent Orientalizations of the borderland populations, the Ottoman Orientalism that Osama Magdisi was writing about, are paralleled by attempts to imagine the Ottoman Empire as some sort of, Islamic, Eastern Oriental modernity? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I have a rather comment that resonates both with the question of that Derek asked and Sergei. It seems to me that we had this new theme emerging, especially if we compare this to the second panel, or the Ukrainian panel, the theme of subjectivity. The location of subjectivity or the absence of subjectivity, the question that was raised already yesterday. Now, in these cases, we see that, well, let's call this empire, but we understand that we're speaking about this just general umbrella network that incorporates different localities, the exceptionalism. And there is some active subjectivity, the active authority that was lacking in some other situations, as we discussed yesterday, and that it had some vision, probably competing visions of the regimes of incorporating difference, exceptionalism, and dealing with authorities. And we see that, and again, it resonates with Sergei's question exactly because to have this vision, you have to adjust, to somehow address the challenge of the normative Enlightenment modernity with its built-in European centrism. It's not just European centrism, it's just because the modernity was inscribed in the specific milieu of French language, German language, to a lesser extent English language, public spheres. And you get the whole package. You're modern and you got to buy this French perspective or British perspective and whatever your interpretation of this perspective. So now we got the question that we have these active subjects in the case of Ottomans to a certain period, in case of Romanos, again to a certain period, when it became disintegrated and the regime panicked and became its own major killer, of course. And again, the void is no less important than the active presence. So why these visions were certainly like in this Russian Federation, but in much more compact and less heterogeneous modern-day Ukraine, for example. So what maybe another question, what makes this subjectivity present or absent, coherent or absolutely not self-conscious? This is my comment and also question.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I wanted to ask Andrei, how did, okay, of course you mentioned about how Pan-Slavism transformed the Russian visions of Bessarabia, but I was wondering how that was complicated by religion. In other words, the religious Romanian Orthodox Church and how, but also Latin culture, how that was, how that complicated Pan-Slavism itself, and but also created this kind of Romanian uniqueness or exceptionalism, but from the Russian side in the Balkans.
Yes, Dara.
I also have a couple of sort of questions, specific questions to Andrei. It kind of seems to me that in the Soviet period, Moldova was very much sort of orientalized by Russian intellectuals, presented as a sort of surprisingly Western borderland, yes, yet sort of backward. Was there a similar discourse in the period you are looking at, sort of originating from Russian imperial observers? And if it was this kind of discourse of orientalization of Bessarabia, how did local actors respond to it? And then how intensive was a kind of national movement during the 1905 revolution? Because you mentioned the First World War as an important turning point, but again in other areas, even say Siberia, there's a kind of huge sort of outburst of activities in 1905. So something similar in Moldova, in Bessarabia.
It's probably time to turn to the speakers, but then I have to put, one hand and take the chair's hat. And I would like to probably throw a comment, question to both panelists in this panel. Marina McGillner, at sometime yesterday in one of the panels, asked the question of, do we still work with the master narratives and generalized categories, key concepts, if you will, when we're talking about exceptionalism, notwithstanding these categories and narratives' complicity in colonialism, in oppression, in taking out people's subjectivities, etc., etc. I think it's very interesting where you see in the Ottoman case certain ruptures associated with inscription or partaking in these processes, where this language of exceptionalism starts to appear. So I would like you to come back to this other question, and that's been undergirded emphasized in Ilya's question of how do we work analytically with our meta historical language, that is when we address a number of big questions outside of the empirical cases that we study. And what is the relationship in the story of exceptionalism and these key categories? And that's a historical, interestingly enough, that's a historical process. That once the historical actors start to think about homogenization, they invoke the language of exceptionalism because somehow certain situations, colonial or imperial, don't fit into the logic of modern imagination of what politics, what society. The other thing that I wanted to say here is that we seem to understand that when we say exceptionalism, it's not a faithful description of social or historical reality, but it's a claim being made by those in history, or perhaps some entrepreneurs and intellectuals today. It's a powerful claim. Powerful because if you say that you are the only one who can translate one culture into another, and you are the intermediary, that's a claim to power, right? I mean, that's not just a wonderful position of making sure cultures talk to each other. What is interesting is that you see a certain power logic in the functioning of the empires, where they get into the spin of modernizing and reshaping its vision, and then creating a system of both exclusion and inclusion in the case of exceptionalism. And then you can see how that translates into identitarian politics, where people start to identify with exception as the foundation of their identity and their politics and the very sense of belonging that is based on the exception. So, and that represents a continuum from the empire to the post-imperial, perhaps, situation. So this is, but the politics in both senses is throughout, as we talked about the exception in these two senses. This is what I wanted to also kind of throw into the discussion, so that we don't forget that these are claims, and they're very, very powerful claims. So I changed my hats and said, turn the floor to the speakers to answer the first round of questions. The same order, Dina, would you like?
Yes, I'm trying to figure out how to answer this. Perhaps I should answer yours first, since it's constructed in a wide, very widely. And I think, yes, of course, these are claims. But we also have to be very careful. Claims of exceptionalism are claims about certain readings of reality that are imbued with relationships of power and ways. So this is sort of accepted. I'm not challenging this. What interests me is how these claims get reworked in the context of practice. And I'm not sure, frankly, whether working with master narratives such as exceptionalism or Orientalism, it allows us to speak across space, but ultimately, how do we manage difference? What sort of different distinctions are? And I think account for specificities of practice, as well as the terms distinctions carry through across borders and across categories. But I still think it's an interesting sort of way of talking. What sort of claims do empire make about their own exceptionalism? What sort of subjectivities they help shape? What sort of internal reworking of these subjectivities on the ground? But these are always, for me at least, as a historian, particularly as a social historian, grounded in negotiations on the ground and interactions between you and all. The modernization discourse is central to this. And whether you speak about it in terms of exceptionalism is another issue, because it seems to me this is a pervasive discourse that all empires have to deal with. This is the way that local elites, provincial elites, developed this view of exceptionalism out of their concern with modernization, rather than the other way around. You see what I mean? And it's a crucial way of actually breaking and entering into this very, very wide definition and very, very, it's sort of, it reminds me, in the 1960s and 70s, Ottoman historians tried to sort of work against the exceptionalism of the Eastern question and the diplomacy by working within the narrative, particularly on the left within Turkey, of the Asiatic mode of production. And it was so wide as to become analytically useless. And it's very important, I think, that we are very careful how we deal with exceptionalism and situate it within the context of the specific. Another issue for me would be talking about Borderlands on connection across across borderlands be a better way and across empires, diasporic communities, trading communities, traveling military labor forces. How do these empires connect and talk about discourses? That would be more, I think, in some ways, takes us in more interesting ways of talking about empires that are different, at least on a political level. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think that's my skepticism about exceptionalism as a category of analysis stems from this sort of concern about, by focusing about it as a discourse of power and distinction that is internalized, creates new subjectivities, we're missing a lot of other options at empires in terms of time and space. Let me talk about, I think, answer Tarek's. You actually raise a very interesting question, and I'm not sure I can answer it when it comes to issues of orientalization and certainly the discourse on modernization, on Europeanization, on the creation of a sort of enlightenment subjectivity is very derivative, consciously derivative, and is taken by the Ottoman elite. And I'm not only talking about the Ottoman elite in Istanbul, but also elites within central areas of producing knowledge, like Cairo, Damascus, and in the 19th century, Beirut becomes crucial in the creation of Ottoman Orientalism, this sort of othering of populations that refuse to, according to these narratives, become modern, and modernity is construed in Enlightenment terms. Having said that, once these people begin to write about what their perception of modernity is, it's a totally hybrid form. It draws, for example, on a revival of Islamic intellectuals and incorporates that, particularly on issues of tribe, for example. The sort of literature on tribe is a very venerable literature in the Islamic lands. It has major intellectuals who've written about it in terms of civilization, hadara, they call it, urbanism, and Bedouinism or tribalism as they divide it. So what the Ottoman elite, both in provincial centers at the center, is create a hybrid form of they mimicked certain European forms of enlightenment, and also borrowed from the old. And somebody like Usama Maqdisi, for example, totally, whose work I admire greatly and is a friend, but I think completely is unable to look at this. It's completely hybridized, and this is the way that it moves very easily, and perhaps this is the way it never becomes, except in very specific circumstances, such an exclusivist and homogenizing discourse of exception, because it borrows from both. I'm not sure if this is the major problem there. The issue of Islamic modernity and exceptionalism and conversion, yes, I think you're right. I mean, and there is not much chance to go into this, but particularly it was primarily an urban discourse. And when we talk about the creation of the projection of Ottoman modernity as a specific kind of modernity, these missionaries also talked about themselves as projecting the example of the marriage between Islam and modernity. It's an Islamic kind of modernity. And in this, they were not being very creative. They had people coming in from India, Indian traditions. We keep looking west for the Ottoman Empire. But I think we need to start moving east for sort of exchanges of constructions of exceptionalism of some sort. And they were drawing on that intellectual tradition itself. And in that sense, they, particularly in Abdul Hamid's time, was an authoritarian very authoritarian and suppressive regime in certain respects, but it was in many other respects a populist regime. It created a subjectivity, helped create subjectivity to talk about this. It created new kinds of ways of talking about being an Ottoman that were not confined to European educated elites, but also could speak the tribal elites who settle and become neo-feudal elites much more effectively. But certainly the concept of Ottomanism, being an Osmanli, is very much the creation of a hybrid subjectivity between being modern and being Islamic, and this is what constituted our exceptionalism. And I think that's all I'm going to say.
Well, yeah, there are some very interesting and general questions. And indeed, this question, I would start with Tariq's question on how to distinguish first from derivative from non-derivative discourses, or rather where to find these, how to identify them. I would say that maybe, of course, well, first of all, and here I agree with Dina, these were consciously derivative discourses. I mean, these intellectuals and elites who articulated these discourses more often than not referred to their Western European models as such. But this does not preclude, of course, the creativity inherent in this derivation, if you will, in the sense that how exactly these discourses were instrumentalized, how they were used for local purposes, how they were connected to the local political or intellectual setting. All of this remained quite non-deterministic, I would say. So that is why, of course, one cannot talk anymore for many decades already, but still, about influences or in this very instrumental fashion. And even the category of transfers, which is quite used today and which did make a significant contribution to the nuancing of many East-West, if you wish, interactions, still does not account very well for the way in which these models initially elaborated in the West were received, or how they were received, by whom, in what form, because for my impression is that it's all very well on the theoretical level, but when we go down to the empirical cases, then of course the situation is much more complicated. And I remember, a recent article by Maria Todorova on different temporalities in the Balkans, as opposed to the West. This might be a solution in the sense that we are still sometimes thinking in categories of hierarchical categories of time, of space, even if we claim that we do not, because it's embedded in our cultural code somehow. And it's very difficult to, while admitting that the processes underway in Eastern Europe were, in a way, secondary, admitting that they were also, region-specific. I do not know if I'm very clear in my... but because this did not necessarily presuppose a hierarchical attitude to all these processes. So, of course, the question remains: how can we distinguish? And, for example, to return to Professor Howe's yesterday's talk on the British model, or the British historiography, what do we do with claims like that of Laia Greenfeld, right, who sees the English nationalism as unprecedented, as the epitome of modern nationalism? Of course, it is not that simple. This is a matter of, in a way, reification, I don't know. And the same holds for for the reception of these Western models in Eastern Europe, because the West, of course, was not monolithic. And when we see what the Romanian intellectuals do with these models, just again to give an example, they creatively reappropriate them. Even, yes, the French, and of course the Ottoman, I'm sure, do the same, the Ottoman. So they, in a way, what is happening in Eastern Europe is a sort of borrowing, selective borrowing, but borrowing not from just for the sake of taking the whole model for granted, because the West itself, as Martin Malia put it in his book on Russia, for example, and here one can argue about his, okay, but still, when he talks about the bicephalous West of the late 19th and early 20th century. So it depended very much from where exactly you drew your model, and then it could respond to local circumstances in better ways than others. So in a way, this is a case-by-case, I would say, method. But of course, this does not answer the question of to what extent the larger categories are still applicable. And here I would make a circle and return to Alex's question. I do agree that all these claims of exceptionalism are very much related to the empire's drive to modernize, and the problem is how we can conceptualize this tendency. Either we stay with the impression that the empires were latecomers to this modernity and they just wanted to catch up, which I don't really think, because empires were effective in many ways that nation-states weren't. Or we view these exceptionalisms as just as many methods to define what space can be, for example, how to define the imperial core, right? Or how to define a space that can be modernized within an empire without renouncing its claim to the control over the peripheries. You understand what I mean? Because there was a very complex process of trying to modernize and selectively take these tendencies that, were viewed as progressive or without necessarily abandoning the earlier imaginings, imperial imaginings. And exactly in this, in this synthesis, one could see the specific methods of modernization that some of the empires we're talking about chose. But of course, it is a claim, and it is a claim made, yes, by cultural entrepreneurs. Here I can only agree. Now, the theme of subjectivity. This is a very complicated question because I myself was constantly struggling with it. Where is subjectivity? When is it constantly there, or does it appear at a certain moment? Who are the actors that display this subjectivity? I don't have definitive answers, but I think that one could combine, for example, a sociological analysis with an intellectual history approach and see where the subjectivity was located in the case of, for example, the borderlands of the Russian Empire, if we take a more concrete case. Because I do believe, and this is a matter of belief, I admit, more than solid proof, I do believe that there is never, no situation exists where there is no subjectivity at all, that's for sure. But the problem is to what extent it has an impact on practice. Because in the borderlands of the Russian Empire, and again, this depends very much on whom are we talking about. If we're talking about a certain elite group, if we're talking about intellectuals who frame these projects for nation building, for empire building, if we're talking about the peasantry, then of course their subjectivity is manifested in radically different ways. And all these games with terms, resistance, accommodation, collaboration, they do point to some differentiated forms of subjectivity that the empires themselves created sometimes, unwittingly or not, or consciously or not, and to unintended consequences, basically. So I think that here, indeed, subjectivity is linked with all sorts of topics, like, for example, the topic of, or the motive of cultural relativism, in a way. Because how I viewed this is, if you take, again, the concrete case of the Romanians and their perception by the Russians, how was the subject of the object of observation, viewed by the Russians? It could be viewed in Enlightenment terms as, and I'll return to this, as differing in scale of development. It could be viewed in terms of temporal displacement, as this case I invoked does, Vigo, where he says that the Romanians are not inferior, they are earlier, simply. They will realize their potential. So it's a sort of very specific, twisted, I'd say, cultural relativism in the sense that it combats the Enlightenment narrative. And of course, I don't want to delve into Eurasianism and all that. So the subjectivity itself was a category that was redefined by its users constantly, and the objects of their observation, and the object could frame the conditions for this. Anyway, but still the question, of course, remains when it is present, when it is absent, and I think this requires some kind of situational approach, case-by-case approach. Otherwise, okay. Now to more concrete questions. How did Ilya asked how did the religious factor complicate matters? It did complicate matters. It also did simplified matters from, and I'm going to answer because more concretely, because for example, the perception of the modern, to start from Romania, the perception of the modern Romanian nation-state in Russian intellectual circles, especially after the 1860s, was mostly negative. It was actually a case of stigmatization. Why? First of all, because, and again, I'm generalizing that. First of all, because because of this pan-Slavist tendency to view the Romanians as an obstacle to pan-Slavic unity, but that's on the very superficial level only. Also, because the Romanian church was viewed as an agency of, latent Catholicization, I would say. So actually, the Russian discourse did not view the Romanians as truly Orthodox, and the Romanians responded in kind, by the way. But that's another matter. So why the Russians did that was, of course, because partly the rituals of the Romanian church, the alphabet, which they switched to the Latin alphabet in the 1860s, the fact that the king remained Catholic, he did not convert, and so on and so forth. All this was used very effectively, I would say, in Bessarabia included, for propaganda purposes. But this also, of course, pointed to the fundamental difference of legitimizing principles of the political discourse in the Russian Empire and Romania. So, in fact, the Romanian church was secularized and nationalized very thoroughly by the modern nation-state, which was anti-clerical for most of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Russians, of course, did not fail to notice these developments. But also in Bessarabia, the fact that the Romanian-speaking population was Orthodox simplified the Russian empire-building and even nation-building project, because the Bessarabians were mostly viewed as a potential part of the core, of the great Russian nation. Not an actual part because of their language, which was the main impediment. But of course, the religious affinities did, accelerate this, at least in the imagination of Russian intellectuals, these processes of assimilation or Russification, and I am aware of the very undefinable, essence of this term. But anyway, so religion could have a double edge. Sometimes emphasizing the difference, like Russia versus Romania, and sometimes emphasizing the affinities. Although, and this points to the difference between the two settings. Okay. Now, yes, to Vera's question, the orientalization of Bessarabia, yes, it did exist. Even more, I think, than in the Soviet period, because in the Soviet period it was qualified by the friendship of the peoples and all the. In the imperial period, especially in the first half of the 19th century, Bessarabia was very much viewed as part of the Ottoman realm. Still, at least during the first 2 or 3 decades of the 19th century, and this orientalization was expressed through many tropes, I would say. Starting from the exotic climate and vegetation and so the scenery and so on, from the basic level, and to the mores of the inhabitants, which were viewed as savage, as lacking in civilization, of course, as corrupt, as lazy. So the whole array of Orientalist cliches was there, and I can elaborate on that. But gradually this gave way to a more integrative approach. And finally, the question on the 1905-7 versus 1914. Well, I did emphasize that 1905-7 was important in the discursive, mainly, as a discursive stage, in the sense of the appearance of the press and so on. But if we talk about political mobilization and of the national movement, it was very weak still in Bessarabia, and that's why I said that Bessarabia was in a way exceptional due to the lateness of the development of the national. It was, I mean, these people could be counted, I don't know, maybe there were several dozens of them, or I don't know, but only after 1914. Well, actually, the fact was that, and I did fail to mention that. During the 1905-7 electoral campaign, 1906-7 electoral campaigns, the nationalists failed utterly to mobilize the peasantry. On the other hand, the Russian, I'm finishing. The Russian.
Take your time.
Okay.
Finish your answer.
The Russian rightist organizations, Chernosotians, were very successful, and there is this question: why? Sorry. Partly, yes, but anyway, Khrushchevan, Purishkevich, and all these very nice people. But still, the discrepancy between the effectiveness of the rightist organizations, which appealed to the peasantry's conservatism, to its loyalty to the dynasty, and so on, as compared to the lack of effectiveness of the national movement, was conspicuous here. And I don't want to go into the details why that was, but that was partly due to the nature of the local elite, how it cooperated with the center, to the lack of literacy, to the to this weakness of the public sphere, and so on and so forth. And in 1914-18, the situation was radically different because of the nationalization of the masses during the war, due to the creation of military units. And these played a fundamental role in the spread of this nationalist ideology within the masses, although this did not spread very far. And this was obvious during the interwar period when Bessarabia was a part of Romania and was completely unprepared to be subjected to the nationalizing policies of a homogenizing nation state. So still Bessarabia is a case that points to this weakness of the national movements in some of the peripheries.
Yes, I suggest we gather comments in the remaining part of our discussion. What I would suggest is that to move the table a little, depending on how many commenters we have, and probably once we're finished the comments, we can break a little earlier and shift the schedule. But comments, please, those who wanted to. Steve?
Yeah, quick comment, if I may, and then a question that's perhaps more like an invitation or a request. Comment just very quickly. Differential temporalities or claims about them surely are not always or even usually alternatives to notions of hierarchy, claims of superiority, etc., but may very often be at their heart. as for instance in the sort of argument Johannes Fabian has made famous, claims that, say, you are at a stage corresponding to our earlier one, you represent our or even humanity's childhood, etc., have been very important to imperial, to civilizational and other discourses of hierarchy. It may even be that a typical form of the discourse of exceptionality is one framed in terms of temporality, certainly a very widespread one. My question come invitation, though, is this. It strikes me that a sub-theme running through both papers, many of the contributions earlier and some yesterday, is what, to quote from Andrei's abstract, calls the slow emergence of an articulate public sphere in Bessarabia. Now, we've had allusions to questions about many aspects of this public sphere, about its secondary or derivative or otherwise character, its eastward and or westward looking, etc., etc. It's about imperial public spheres, anti-imperial public spheres, nationalist public spheres. Now, I'm sure in every case people have in mind, these first emerge actually in very small circles, rather small numbers of people in very particular places. Certainly, I think in the Arab Ottoman case, these places are more often than not coffee houses. I don't know about the Bessarabian one. So in a sense, my invitation is to have more and more explicitly comparative filling in about these people and places. I want, as it were, to smell the coffee in the coffee houses and to know a little bit about who's meeting there, in the way that, for instance, a bit further west from Dina's main focus, the writings of Khoury Sakakini give us a bit of a sense of smelling the coffee, of who's in these small gatherings, what newspapers and journals are on the table when they meet, what books they have at home, and so where are they deriving things from. And for that matter, and perhaps this is a small reminder of how very male these early public spheres were in I think almost all these cases, who is washing up the coffee cups afterwards. So a request really to know something more of the spaces where these discourses are emerging, where that will in part help give contextualized answers to some of the bigger questions, including the ones about secondariness or derivativeness, which I think I'd want to urge. This is not an either-or question. And that perhaps is quite well symbolized by the fact that depending whether you look at different editions or on the title page or on the front cover or the ISBN details of the now famous book by Partha Chatterjee that put that notion of the derivative discourse into circulation, in some places there's a question mark, in some there isn't. It's almost like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, which in the first editions had a question mark after that title. Later ones dropped the question mark. So I think we should go with the versions of Partha Chatterjee that have the question mark after derivative discourse.
Please. Okay. So this is a comment mostly directed to Andrei, and it's based on what I imagine must be my own very selective perception of Russian 19th century imperial visions and imaginaries about Bessarabia. So I'm thinking maybe this will turn into a question and you can correct me or help me figure it out later. But I'm listening to you and I'm really fascinated with this idea of the imagination of this oscillating space that's 1 minute it's west, the next it's our colony, the next it's filled with people that violate Panslavism, and then so. But there's a thread that keeps niggling at me, and maybe it's just my impressionistic notion of what Russians seem to have been saying about Bessarabia. And excuse me, but I have to quote from Pushkin. But there's this poem Tsigane, which everybody knows, right? 1824, and the end of it, the very end of the poem Gypsies, is he's looking at the flag. Aleko, this is in right? He's looking at the imperial flag. It's on the border. There's a sort of sadness, but pride about the extension of the empire through Bessarabia. And this landscape that he's described in the poem, Aleko is working through, right, that Pushkin's describing with all his footnotes that make it sort of an ethnographic text, but also a poem. But it's empty of Bessarabians. It's gypsies who are peopling that region, and they're moving, right? So they're moving, and then the empire can move after them. So there's something about how figuring that space as a space that's open to imperial expansion, and like there are no Bessarabians there. There's these nomads, right, that somehow don't even belong there. And I was thinking that there's something really interesting, maybe that maybe the intellectuals that you're talking about, is there some way that they're responding to that as well? Is there some way that configuration of the space is pulled in a kind of a, no, we are actually here, there's somebody here, no? But I don't know, that could just be my own very narrow sort of reading based on my own interests.
I'll further respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise this, again, following Stephen, this issue of how helpful the very notion of derivative is. And to me, it's actually hugely unhelpful, because if we look at almost any discourse, we'll see connections with sort of others. And
that means questioning the originality of whatever is claimed to be original.
Questioning of the originality,
okay.
yes. So most discourses are, in one way or another, derivative. And in a way, the most derivative culture of all is Roman. And I can say it as a former sort of student of classics, when I sort of start reading Roman literature, I could not believe the extent to which it basically reproduced the forms, and indeed, because it's all based on mythology, Greek heritage. But it doesn't mean that then that incredibly powerful culture is then developed. And so there are other reasons of what you describe than, I think, the derivative nature of the discourse. And part is sort of the number of people involved and the weakness of the public sphere, but also, I presume, a political weakness is extremely important. And obviously Roman culture is regarded as probably great and more famous than the Greek, and that's entirely based on the political power. So just to, in a way, emphasize what seems to be the very unhelpful nature of the idea of derivative discourse. And again, with Partha, to kind of connect it with Partha Chatterjee, when I read his book, I was struck by how similar what he describes, that he sort of makes a little bit of a claim of exceptionality to what he describes, to what extent, how similar it is to the Russian case. And actually, similar processes were happening in Russia earlier than in India. So, again...
Alessandro.
Yes, I wanted to jump into what Dina said during the debate now. I think it's something important that can be useful also for this discussion. And this is how further or beyond are we ready to go beyond side Orientalism? Is there a life beyond one side Orientalism? And I think that now we can handle something, because many people are entering this way, and I think it's a very interesting way. And so for you, I have 2 or 3 questions to develop this. First, about discourse and chronologies. Excuse me, as usually. There was a debate in the Ottoman Empire about what is a frontier and the center, well beyond the debate with the West. It was a previous and long-term debate about the periphery and the claiming, again, of some Turkish part against the other parts, precisely when there was a decentralized empire. And this is well before the Orientalism. So first, the chronology, in your case, is wonderful. But second, maybe the identification not of the exceptional, but of the frontier is extremely important, because it was not only the Ottoman Empire, it was exactly the same in the Qing, by saying it is Beijing or the Mongol frontier. It depends if they were the Manchus speaking or the Han, exactly the same. And the poor Mughal trying to say, I'm from Afghanistan, so the core is not there, it's from the north, but Hindu said, no, what are you talking about? So this idea was extremely important, and the definition of what was the periphery was a major claim. But still, a claim, and this is a little bit different of what Sasha said, sometimes it works, sometimes it does not work. And for this, I need to know precisely in which situation such a claim can work. French are still going on nowadays, since decades, to claim that they are the core of Europe. It doesn't work. I mean, nobody believes. So the problem is that you need something more than a claim to assess that you are the center. So how it works concretely in historical definite situation, when and why, for example, Turkey was able to impose it as against other core. And this is possible to think in terms of decentralized empire. I mean, with a mobile frontiers. You talk about crossing the borders. But after all, the notion of a frontier as a border is very late, is a second half of the 19th century. Before, the frontier was a mobile space, and when I worked with merchants or even pilgrims moving in inner Eurasia or between the Ottoman or the Khanate or Muscovy or India, they didn't care about which empires they belong. Some people in some towns say, no, you belong to me, you have to pay the fees to me. But there was not directly their concerns, and they were not even crossed the boundaries, because they were not fixed boundaries. There was a mobile frontier. And so probably, again, the chronology is extremely important. When the frontier as a boundary was settled, identified, for some people, this is an invention of the nation state. For some other people, absolutely not. There was a transformation of the empires in the second half of the 19th century, which drove to this. But this is an open question. And what do you think, starting from your case?
It was Marina.
Okay.
It was yours?
Okay,
Well, I just have a...
Could you stand?
they like it.
They really likes me to stand up. I just had a brief comment and a question for Andrei. And the thing is, the concept of imperial exceptionalism is really a rather rich one. It can be sort of seen from the imperial center, from the periphery, and it functions on a number of levels. And my question is more about the imperial context and the possibilities of comparison within the imperial space. And there are a number of regions in the Russian Empire where similar, or at least on some level, similar processes were going on. And I'm thinking of Georgia, for example, right? You have the same problem of sort of Orthodox church, but not entirely Orthodox in the view of the Russian bishops who literally come to rule over the Georgian diocese. Of course, minus the national state outside of the borders of the Russian Empire. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
I have to say that my, it seems I sort of opened a can of derivative worms. my initial questions about the derivative discourse was actually aiming at the original, obviously in far too opaque way. So I totally agree. What's at stake is how do you actually distinguish a derivative from an original discourse? And you might very well end up finding that there are no original discourses, or maybe very few. But the discussion as it has developed also makes me think that if we use derivative as a category in a sort of modernization theory objectifying way, then of course it's fairly useless. That's clear. But if you want to go beyond this, and if you use it as a category, in fact, of subjectivity and in fact of identity making, I think it becomes much more interesting again, because we have to then ask about, it's an obvious question, but it still has to be asked, the way in which historical actors actually conceive themselves as derivative. And in fact, derivative, we slip easily into thinking that it's denying agency or it's not empowering. But derivative can actually be empowering. And you see it very much in Borderlands, that's my experience, that you actually have competitive derivation going on. For example, between Poles and Ukrainians inside the Habsburg Empire, and then also playing with derivation that can also come out of Moscow, out of the Russian Empire. So we have people like Romanov and Grushevsky is a whole different story. But in fact, so I would make an argument for completely agreeing that derivation, if it's used to relegate either Eastern Europe or Borderlands to this sort of, shadow realm where nothing is real and nothing is original, it's very useless. But if we use it to investigate how they conceive of themselves and actually can become, how this actually can become also means of using derivation as sort of a judo-like throw in which suddenly it turns out on top and you can have something derivative but something that can compete with a discourse that calls itself original, then I think it is a valuable category. I would like to keep that question on the table.
I suggest at this moment we turn it to the panelists to respond. They were comments, so choose the way you would like to relate to the discussion, to the exchange that happened.
Well, I mean, I think Stephen brings up a very important issue, and I think it goes to what Ilya raised, and I'm not sure I answered very well, the issue of subjectivity. What are we talking about? And so the idea of developing ways of talking across empires about public spaces where intelligentsia and subjectivities, certain kinds of subjectivities were formed and formulated ideas of exceptionalism, of relationship to the Enlightenment, the derivatives, although that's not how they framed it, is certainly a very sort of good field by which to talk across these empires as well, rather than only in terms of exceptionalism. In terms of the issue of differential temporality, particularly on issues of modernization, I think in the projection of Ottoman power outwards, certainly Ottoman intellectuals took this as part of their exception. We're getting there. We're just getting there at a certain. They define themselves temporally vis-a-vis the West and vis-a-vis the modernity. Certainly, I think the issue of studying, the intelligentsia begins to emerge in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, in the coffee house, as well as the press that circulated is certainly a venue through which we can study subjectivity. I want to, before I go to Alessandro's, which is a huge question, talk about the issue of derivative. I'm always interested in the whole issue of one word derivative emerges in public discourse among academics. And I think we need to situate it that way, because it's also a discourse on modernization, ultimately. And certainly, I don't know in the Russian case, certainly discussions of the Enlightenment among intellectual elites in coffee houses and in the press. I don't know about coffee houses, it was very much an oral culture. But certainly in the press, did not, the issue of derivativeness never comes up in the 18th and 19th century. In rather what, or it doesn't, if it comes up, it's sort of one of several ways of talking about modernity. There's no copyright, concept of copyright in the transfer of intellectual ideas within the public domain. So the issue of origins and the issue of relationship to origins is an important one, but it's not defined in terms of derivativeness, at least in the 19th century. It becomes an issue at the beginning of the 20th century with the emergence of nationalist discourses. This is ours and not ours. And so I'm interested actually in the whole notion of derivativeness and what it emerges and what it speaks about sort of spaces of intellectual interaction. So I wouldn't take it off the table at all. In fact, it's a very interesting concept because it's central to the formation of exceptionalism of any sort. So I think it's a good way of, I wouldn't take it off the table. And so to the Roman Empire didn't have nationalism to deal with, so we forced nationalism. So,
Pre-nationalism.
I think Alessandro raises a lot of great questions. And I'm thinking as you're talking to me about this wonderful book by an anthropologist, and I don't know if other anthropologists think of it as a wonderful book, but it's called The Grades of Terror, and it's by Khoury. And it traces over several centuries the diasporas that come from southern Yemen into Indonesia and into the Indian Ocean. It's a superb way of getting at connections and discourses and ways of looking at that I find much more interesting than talking about issues of exceptionalist discourses of power, frankly, and more useful to giving us a sense of what existed on the ground. So in that sense, I think you raise this whole issues of how we talk about frontiers, how do we sort of disassemble these sort of units that are empires. I have no clue what the Ottoman Empire is, frankly, in the 19th century. You know, it's a conglomeration of things that work somehow, and they work at certain periods, and so it's very important to sort of deconstruct empire, I think. But I also think it's very useful to think of exceptionalism, at least in the Ottoman case, I can't speak for the Russian case, as a strategy of rule. And so if we can frame exceptionalism as a strategy of rule, I think we can talk across borders or spaces. So that's my answer. But I'd like to pick up a lot of other stuff on more person because it becomes quite specific.
Andrei.
Yes, I'll try to be a bit more brief this time. To your questions, yes, they are, and comments, they are very important. And I guess I gave the impression that I was talking about when talking about temporalities and cultural hierarchies, about different discourses. Well, they are different, but not in the sense that they are opposed, of course. So I agree completely that you can't. On the contrary, in concrete case the Russians did. The Russian pan-Slavists did was shift the terms of the discourse somehow and shift the vocabulary, but not the essence, because of course the otherness remained there, and it was conceived slightly differently, and the hierarchy was different. It was not depicted in the same terms, but essentially it was there, very much there. And of course the pan-Slavist discourse itself was the discourse of exceptionalism. That's obvious. But much more important from the methodological point of view, indeed, is this concrete level, for me personally, is the concrete level of the spaces where these discourses appeared. As one colleague once told me, when I hear the term discourse, I realize that I cannot touch it, smell it, or whatever, so you can't really analyze it. And he was right in a way, because we're talking about people, not discourses. So actually, this is the next step of my project. I want to focus on not sociological, I don't pretend to be able to carry out a sociological study, but some kind of prosopographic study of these people, who they were actually. What was the national movement in Bessarabia as opposed to other cases within Russia and outside Russia? And probably it emerged in the tea houses as opposed to the coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire. As we know, in the Russian Empire there was this tea culture, and definitely there was a very complex negotiation between these new intelligentsia and the old elites. And exactly in this sense, I think we can assess the impact of all these press and texts that were produced and so on, because the impact was, to put it mildly, not very important until very late, until the World War I, basically. But anyway, to focus on these spaces, concrete spaces, groups, institutions, perhaps, which engendered this discourse, is my next priority. So thank you for raising this issue.
And the women who washed the teacups.
Definitely, I won't forget that. Okay. Yes, to Elena's question now. Well, no, actually, I would say the literary perspective on Bessarabia due to Pushkin is distorting things, really. But in essence, you are very correct in touching this problem, because well, when the Russian Empire came here, what it found was exactly a classic frontier space, if there is a classic frontier space anyway, a space that was not stable, a space that was indeed distinguished by these military Russian-Ottoman confrontations. We should not forget that there were there was a whole array of fortresses, of Ottoman fortresses that gradually fell to the Russian Empire here. So even on this material, it was a frontier in the military sense. And also the population was in constant flux here for many hundreds of years, especially in the southern parts of this region, which gave their name to the whole. Actually, Bessarabia was extended from the southern region near the Black Sea to the whole province. Anyway, so what the Russians had to do was to order this space, to rationalize it, and to, in a way, civilize it. And that's what they did. But before the 1830s, the Russian Empire was under the impression that its expansion in the Balkans was not final at all. On the other hand, contrary to that, it viewed Bessarabia as a first step towards consolidating its influence in the Balkans. So Bessarabia was a sort of showcase for what the Russian Empire could do in a Christian province emancipated from the Ottomans. So in that sense, yes, Bessarabia was a temporary acquisition at first. Only after the 1830s, when due to all kinds of geopolitical, was the frontier stabilized, and then one could discover really the local population in a way. So you are correct in this. Well, Pushkin was very biased in here. Not even not biased. I mean, he was creatively rewriting this space and exoticizing it. Yeah. And well, he observed the locals. The locals didn't impress him very much, to put it mildly, because because of many things. But
the question, as I understood it, was were the discourses you talked about a response to exactly this voiding of the territory?
This is more complicated.
Stripping the
and replacing them with this sort of. So there's a sensitivity even now with Romanian nationalists when they're perceived as gypsified, and so I'm wondering if there's, here you see something also. But you're seeing us as the wrong ones, and anyway, we are here. What? How is that?
No, of course,
it's not even. It's the emptiness of the space, but also the usage of this particular other to do so.
No, I understood your question. Simply, I'm not sure how if this discourse was,
or if it was taken up.
Yeah. Because this issue is not very present, this concrete issue with the gypsies, it's not very present in the Moldovan nationalist or whatever Romanian nationalist discourse concerning Bessarabia. It's present in other contexts. So it was a response even from the Imperial, I think, observers somehow, because when they discovered the ethnographic peculiarity of this population, they are, of course, interested by it. And they use the mechanisms devised earlier to observe Bessarabia from this point of view as well. But it is transformed from an empty space into a ordered space. And the empire is, of course, perceived as bringing order to chaos. This is undoubted. But we can discuss this about the gypsies later. But thank you for the question. Now the derivative, I think that much was said about this, and I don't want to take even more time, but I would say that, I don't use this in my, it's not a self-justifying strategy. I don't use this in my text. It just was a category that seemed appropriate for this talk somehow, and I mostly speak about exogenous versus internally generated discourses. And when I speak about the absence of the local voices, I mean that the local, whatever, public sphere, again, or intellectuals, for a very long time, did not have either the will or the mechanisms, or the, indeed, you were right, completely right about the political weakness, and so one could frame this in terms simply of lack of articulation, or lack of, not so much, it was derivative, of course, but it was mostly this opposition between exogenous and endogenous discourses that I was interested in. So, but I'm sure we can develop that further. Yes, and finally, again, Tariq's comments, I do agree, actually, that derivation, again, just to connect, derivation is not necessarily a discursive or even practical weakness. It can, and it did, in many instances, subvert what the empire was doing, for example, or provide agency for these local subjects, even if they, for example, just were using Russian as, in the Borderlands as a means of subverting the empire, and there are many cases like that. And in Bessarabia, also, the Imperial language was a vehicle, in many cases, of access to Western culture and subvert and so on. So there are many ways in which derivative discourses can be turned to the advantage of the subalterns, and here I can express my agreement. Okay, and finally, comparisons with Georgia, and yes, actually, at one point, I and Victor Taki and I wrote an article comparing Bessarabia to Galicia, even, and that was quite a fruitful comparison. And I believe that it is possible and even commendable to compare the Bessarabia with other peripheries. It depends, of course, when. The moment is, the time is crucial, because one could compare Bessarabia in some ways to Finland and Poland in the early part of the 19th century, but mostly from the vantage point of the center, because the situation on the ground was radically different. Well, again, if we understand comparison as similarity, which is not the case, of course, always. But anyway, it is very interesting how the center built this image of the borderlands in which Bessarabia presumably fit, when in the long term it actually didn't, because they had no elite to cooperate with. The bulk of the elite fled to, or, well, simply returned to the Moldovan Principality under Ottoman jurisdiction. So when they discovered that they have no one to work with, basically, or they have to reinvent this elite, then they changed. Again, I'm simply instrumentalizing the things a bit, or simplifying. But anyway, they discovered that they should change the approach, and they redefined Bessarabia as a part of New Russia rather than as a part of the Western borderlands. With Georgia, yes, from the religious point of view, but not from the social point of view, because the Georgian nobility was a much more articulated strata than Bessarabian nobility was ever capable of becoming. So even this 1832 revolt and so on in Georgia was a reaction of a disgruntled elite that was deprived of its, well, privileges in a way. In Bessarabia, the elite was, again, due to these processes, was mostly created or reframed, I don't know, by the Russians. So they never had this leverage, although they tried to negotiate during the first 2 decades, they failed. And also, but of course, so it depends what parameters you compare. And in this sense, Bessarabia can, from some points of view, be even compared to, well, for example, Ilminsky's strategies for dealing with the inarodцы did have some impact on early 20th century church policy in Bessarabia, when one of the Bessarabian bishops tried to use Romanian in dealing with, in proselytizing. And he referred, actually, he was one of the people who was interested in Ilminsky. So there are all kinds of layers that Bessarabia can be compared with And I think this is very fruitful.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists and everyone who contributed to the discussion. We are adjourning 15 minutes earlier than the schedule suggests. We use that for a coffee break. And then we start the next panel. We start the next